Welcome back to Africa This Week with me, Ayo Johnson. 400 years of African slavery have left its imprint on Brazilian culture. From its samba rhythms to syncretic beliefs, over 100 million Brazilians are either black or mixed race. Many don't know their ancestry and their links to Africa lost over the centuries. A documentary series called DNA Africa is reconnecting Brazilians' Afro-Descendants with their African roots through DNA tracing. Filling in the puzzle of history and lost identity, Refuka Fombo has this report for us.
More than a century after slavery officially ended in Brazil, DNA tests are giving Afro-Brazilians the intriguing chance to find out who they are beyond mere skin colour. Slavery was abolished in Brazil 127 years ago, but the vast operation to force Africans to work the Portuguese colonists' plantations and mines resulted in a black and mixed population that today accounts for just over half the 202 million total. Half of the 10 million African slaves taken from the Atlantic ended up in Brazil. DNA testing has opened the door to following that identity trail back. The tests are done in Washington by a company called African Ancestry. Anyone can buy one of their test kits and send this with a saliva swab for analysis. With a database of more than 30,000 indigenous Africans, the company says it can trace original ethnic groups. For the Brazilian documentaries, 150 people have been chosen, most of them black activists, from the 5 states where 4.5 million slaves were brought between the 16th and 19th centuries.
O reencontro com as raízes é importante para qualquer pessoa. Eu acho que todo mundo quer saber quem são seus pais, quem são seus avós, de onde eles vieram, como é que eles viviam, que forma de vida eles tinham. Então, se você não tem essa informação, se essa informação se perdeu, é como se você tivesse perdido no mundo, né? Você não tem chão.
Thanks to the project, actress Zizi Mota, who won fame as the slave Zica da Silva in a 1976 film of the same name, found out that she was an ancestor of the Yoruba tribe located in modern southwest Nigeria and Benin.
A Costa do Marfim. De repente eu abro e descubro que não, que uma pesquisa mais elaborada prova de que eu vim da Nigéria. E aí, para mim, foi uma mistura de surpresa e de emoção muito grande e me deu vontade agora de voltar à Nigéria.
Another documentary participant, Zulu Araho, who heads a cultural center in Bahia, learned he descends from the mostly Muslim Tikar people in Cameroon.
São 7 horas e 15 minutos. Estamos indo para Banquim para encontrar com dos reis Tikar.
The journey into history brought him to the exact place his forefathers left the continent for Brazil. And so, these stories of rediscovery have brought some closure for a few slave descendants. Now, his hope is that the 52-minute documentaries will help restore Afro-Brazilian sense of pride in knowing that they are not merely descendants of slaves.
That was our special report by Require Fombo. To discuss this, we have in the studio Patrick Vernon. He's the executive director and publisher of Every Generation Media, which promotes family genealogy and cultural heritage in the black community. We also have from the United States, Gina Paige, who is the co-founder of African Ancestry, the only company that traces black ancestry back to an African tribe within an African country. Welcome to the show, all of you. Gina, you are in the United States. You must have gone through a lot of challenges creating this company that you've set up. In the context of this new documentary, which is DNA Africa, and how they're doing amazing works tracing Brazilians to their African roots, is this the pinnacle of your successes?
Well, I mean, every time we are able to trace someone's ancestry back to Africa, it's a success. So I wouldn't call this the pinnacle. However, it's the first time that we've been able to trace such a large number of people outside of the United States. And so we're very excited about the opportunity to partner with Cine Group to educate Brazilians and those all over the world about the importance of identity and knowing where you're from.
Knowing where you're from. Patrick, you clearly know where you're from because you've gone through a similar process and you've come back at the end of that process. Tell us, what was it like for you? What did you experience? And what does it tell you about who you are?
Yeah, so I did a DNA test probably about 10 years ago, and I've retaken the test quite a few times, because one thing about DNA, the database gets bigger, so you have to just double check that your results are still accurate. So my family, I was born in England, but my family's from Jamaica, so I did a lot of research work, researching my family history in the Caribbean. Then I took a DNA test, because I only went far back as 1700, looking at records. I took a DNA test and identified that on my mother's side of the family, that one of my ancestors lived in a village called Kedugu in Senegal. So about 7 or 8 years ago, I went to the village, I went to Kedugu in Senegal.
Amazing. So you've been there, you've gone through the process, and you found your family, extended one nonetheless.
Not quite the family. I mean, DNA testing tells you that a descendant of yours lived in this part of the world a few thousand years ago. So it's not the same as a normal DNA test to identify like paternity. It just tells you, it's a deep genealogy DNA test. So it just tells me that one of my ancestors lived in that part of Africa.
Indeed. Gina, looking part of Africa, you've heard of Patrick's story there. How much of that rings true, especially with the Alex Haley, who's known around the world for roots? He traced his own tribe, his own country, or in terms of his linkage and direct with Africa, all those years ago, and did that successfully. Why have others find it so difficult?
Well, for people living in the United States, we weren't recorded as human beings until the 1870 census. So there is no paper trail for most Blacks living in the United States prior to 1870. So I'm not exactly sure how Alex Haley was able to accomplish such a feat. It seems as though his family kept very detailed oral histories that traveled generation after generation. So he's one of the very few that have been able to successfully use paper or non-scientific methods to get back to the continent of Africa. In terms of Patrick's story, this is the first I'm hearing of Patrick's story. Our tests actually don't get you to a specific village. Our tests just look at a present day country and often an ethnic group within the country. So I'm sure Patrick's research was perfectly valid, but I can't speak to that.
Well, it's good. At least people will be able to find out exactly what tribe they're likely to come from, the country of origin, and it gives them a sense of connection, doesn't it?
Absolutely does. I mean, people feel a sense of pride, a sense of belonging, a sense of place. I mean, I don't think that Black Americans are any different than other Blacks outside of Africa in terms of not having a sense of connection and not being taught anything positive about Africa. And so, as you mentioned in the intro, we all grow up believing that our history began with slavery, that we come from slaves and not enslaved Africans. And so this is very powerful for identity transformation when you have a tangible connection, knowing that the DNA that runs through your body, at least with our test, is often found to be identical to DNA with people living in those parts of the world today.
Patrick, Ancestry, tracing your roots, how big an issue is that, or acceptance within the Afro-Caribbean communities here in the UK?
I think there's some similarities with the US. The interesting thing about Alex Haley, he had to come to London, to the British Library, to do all his primary research work, because the difference between America and, say, here in the UK, a lot of people that were enslaved were documented, because in 1833, compensation was given to plantation owners in the English-speaking Caribbean to the tune of £20 million, which is equivalent of £17 billion today. So basically, we were documented, and these are the types of records, ironically, the records that enslaved us are the records that we can use to trace our family history. But the interesting thing about the whole stuff around Roots and Alex Haley and today is actually Roots had more impact, ironically, on white people in America and in Europe to trace their family history than African Americans and even Black British people in the UK. And one of the reasons why is we are still told through the media that our history is one of enslavement. We're not told our history is one of African civilizations, our achievements. So a lot of people still feel a degree of embarrassment or shame to say that my history is about being enslaved. And actually, the key thing is actually looking at the wider perspective around history. And I think the other aspect around family genealogy is it's about time and resources to do that. You know, it took me years to do my research work, and and this is part of the challenge. You know, people it's not as simple as doing an online Google search with your name and you know who your ancestors are. For black people, whether in Brazil, in America, or in Europe, it's more challenging, but that's part of the process.
Part of the process. Gina, how do we ensure that the next generation doesn't feel ashamed, can hold on to their roots, are confident that identifying or making way or showing their connectivity with Africa is one that's prosperous for them, and not, as Patrick have said, one of shame, negativity, and one to do less with in terms of Africa?
Well, I actually think that's a fairly easy answer: education. You know, we are more affluent than we've ever been. We're more educated than we've ever been, and we have access to more information than we've ever had. And so while you can't do a Google search and find your family, you can do a Google search and learn about the history of your people. And so there's so much information out there to educate us. In addition, families that trace their ancestry today have prepared future generations. Because when Patrick found out that his ancestry was shared in Senegal, then his children know, their children will come into the world knowing, their children will come into the world knowing. And so we can start today by answering the question for future generations.
Well, can I ask you this then? What about those communities who are not necessarily in the diaspora, not necessarily in a Western nation, but are actually in Africa itself? And I make reference to those individuals who are living in places like Sierra Leone, where, as we do know, Freetown is the capital of which the first freed slaves were sent back to. Those communities who still hold Western names, Western surnames, which is a reflection of that slavery, how much should they actually go out and find out exactly where they've come from, because they were only placed there, weren't they?
Well, yes, they were, and I think that's a personal decision. If you have a sense of place and a sense of belonging, and you feel good about who you are, and there is no void, and you feel like you are Sierra Leonean, and that's your history, then you're already there. The benefits of this test are for people who feel a void, who want to know where they're from and don't have a sense of connection. Now, should someone whose family descends from those repatriated populations decide to take this test, it certainly will be very valuable for them, because it will answer a question. The time frame of our analysis is the past 500 to 2,000 years. So that would give them some sense of the populations that they share ancestry with during that time period.
Patrick, your organization, Every Generation Media, has done a lot of work in and around this area in trying to get work closer with the youth so that they understand exactly where they've come from and their connection. Tell us a bit more about that, please.
Well, the key things I've done, obviously, I think it's important that young people learn about their history. It's important that they and the families, that there's greater intergenerational dialogue between parents, grandparents, who feel confident in sharing their family histories. So what I've been doing for the last 15 years is organising workshops in the community to help people start the process of researching their family history. But also I've worked closely with museums and archives, because they have a lot of information and records so we can access around family history. I think that's important. I mean, the example you talked about Sierra Leone is quite important, because a lot of people from Sierra Leone are from the Caribbean, because because that was a free colony. So, and Liberia as well, in terms of African Americans going to Liberia. And the interesting thing about the whole stuff around diaspora and learning is very important, because if you look at Britain, there's been a black presence in the UK for over 2,000 years. So it's not simply about the history of enslavement, it's actually about family history and exploring that we are part of world history, not confined to 400 years, we're confined to the history of humanity. And if more young people did more research and families were involved in that process, then more people feel proud about themselves in terms of not just simply about racial pride, but they can work out real life choices. I think that's really important. If you know where you're going as a community, that gives you a sense of purpose. And I think a lot of young people don't have that sense of purpose. But I think family history, along with other stuff, is one element of giving them a sense of purpose.
Well, guess what? I've got a massive sense of purpose right now, and I feel energized. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for in this episode. I want to thank all my guests for joining us and to you at home for watching. We'll leave you with scenes from the Sango Gold Mine in Geita district in northern Tanzania. It's one of 3 Tanzanian mines which will soon receive the Fair Trade label, a testament to the ethical practice and fair trade agreement and operational at the plant right there. We're back next week at the same time. A repeat of the show is aired tomorrow at 4 p.m. Until then, have a good evening.